This week, Joe Rogan repeated a common myth regarding the rising violent crime rates in the United States.
And cops don't do anything if someone jumps into someone's backyard, they don't arrest them. Like, you have to do like $900 worth of theft before they'll even arrest you.
Really?
And if they do arrest you, they just put you right back on the street.
And has it always been that way, or is this after the defunding?
After the defunding.
Yeah.
Well, that's the defunding of the police in Austin's been a disaster too. And New York's been a disaster. It's terrible everywhere. It's a terrible idea. The idea that you're going to send social workers to handle someone's domestic violence case is fucking bananas.
Now, the problem, other than repeating myths before a large and impressionable audience, is that it's not true. There really is no evidence that there have been notable decreases in local police budgets throughout the country. In a few cases where city councils, for instance, have agreed to redirect police funding to other social programs, those measures haven't even taken place yet. They haven't been implemented quite yet. So to blame the rise in crime on defunding the police is just inaccurate. In fact, why don't we actually hear from a cop about this very issue? Laura Cooper, executive director of the Major Cities Chiefs Association, which represents police executives in the United States and Canada, says that the defund the police movement, quote, has not been pervasive, end quote, across their membership cities. And she noted, in a lot of places, they've actually increased police budgets. In fact, if you look at Austin, where Joe Rogan notoriously moved to after besmirching the liberal bastion of Los Angeles, the city council did in fact vote to cut the police budget. But there is a catch. So Austin hasn't technically defunded police, but the city council did vote last year to cut the police department's budget by 1/3, though through measures that included reorganization, but it has not been implemented quite yet. So that's an important takeaway from Austin specifically. And if you look at the broader picture, it's even more clear that scapegoating the defund movement as the cause for violent crime is just unfounded. For instance, a Bloomberg City Lab analysis of 2020 and 2021 police budgets from the 50 largest cities reveals most major U.S. cities, including those that have swung left since the 2016 presidential election, have been unwilling to make meaningful cuts. And what about all those Democrat-led cities, right? They might sign off on a Black Lives Matter mural in front of Trump Tower, but aside from the performative politics, there's a lot of data indicating that they've actually done the exact opposite of what the Black Lives Matter movement advocated for. In fact, more than half of cities where Democrats gained shares maintained or even increased their police budgets. Out of the 42 major cities where Democrats gained share, 24 increased police spending for fiscal year 2021, while 18 of them made cuts. Now, in fact, it doesn't even really matter where you live in the country. Even if you're living in a part of the country that did vote to decrease or redirect some of that police funding, the truth is crime is up everywhere, all across the country, especially violent crime like homicides and murders. Cooper, the person that I referred to earlier about how the defund movement is unfounded, added the Major Cities Chiefs Association data shows violent crime has increased even in the first quarter of 2021, regardless of whether cities increased or decreased their police budget. In fact, the spike in violent crime is not something that should be ignored, right? So there are myths out there about what's causing the spike in violent crime. And unfortunately, a lot of those myths are being uttered by GOP lawmakers who want to use it as a political tool to fearmonger and to campaign. But the left needs to be honest about the reality of these increasing crime rates. And more importantly, we need to have a discussion about what we can do, how we can offer alternatives to ensure that the pendulum does not swing from a more criminal justice reform side to a brutal, tough on crime side, which is likely to happen if we ignore this issue. So let's take a look at just how bad crime has gotten.
The 80% spike in Minneapolis homicides this year is part of a nationwide surge in murders during the pandemic.
We're seeing something historic here.
Jeff Asher is a crime analyst in New Orleans who has studied 2020 data for more than 50 cities.
And in those cities, murder is up about 36% this year relative to last year, which, to put that in some perspective, the largest national year-to-year change we've ever had is a 12.5% increase.
While most crime, including home burglaries and robberies, has gone down, murder rates have risen sharply, both in large cities like New York, Chicago, and Seattle, and in smaller ones like Lubbock, Texas, and Greensboro, North Carolina.
Now, violent crime, of course, has a huge impact on communities, not just toward people who are actually injured or killed as a result of this crime, but it has a crippling effect psychologically on members of the community. This is a serious problem that should be addressed head on. So what exactly explains the spike in violent crimes? Even though most police budgets have not been cut as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement, the reality is that policing did change a little bit. They took a more hands-off approach during the coronavirus pandemic. In fact, here's Police Chief of Los Angeles, Michael Moore, explaining exactly why.
Like in many U.S. cities, COVID-19 has led to police staffing shortages and handcuffed efforts to target violence.
We're not having meetings, social interactions, and engagements that we would normally have to help stem this. We've had more than 800 of our personnel that have come down with the COVID virus. We have two that we have lost, two of our employees, one an officer and one a detention officer. So we know firsthand the impact of this pandemic.
So during the coronavirus pandemic, police did seem to take a more hands-off approach, which is hard to believe considering all of those brutal videos that we've seen of police using excessive force and brutality to respond to Black Lives Matter protesters. But when it comes to most interactions with people committing crime, it seems like the police decided to kind of let things go here and there in order to avoid contracting the virus or putting themselves in some sort of dangerous situation as a result of the virus. But does that really explain all of the crime? No, definitely not. It could be a factor. I would probably say a small factor. But when you consider scaled back policing during the pandemic and the explosion of guns in the country, you start to see this dangerous cocktail, which I think does, to some extent, increase crime. For instance, FBI data suggests nearly 40 million guns were sold last year, a 40% increase from 2019. New data from Northwestern University and the Harvard Injury Control Research Center found roughly 20% of those who bought guns last year were first-time gun owners. The research also found 39% of American households now own guns, up from 32% 5 years earlier. And look, there are other factors at play. The opioid epidemic didn't go away. It didn't just magically disappear just because the media decided to stop talking about it or our politicians stopped addressing it. It's still very much a problem, and the number of people addicted to opioids has only increased during the pandemic, probably because people have been struggling with economic anxiety, this system of inequality. And oftentimes when people resort to drugs, they're looking for escapism, and opioids unfortunately fall under that category. But I do think it's worth discussing the biggest impact on crime, and that's poverty. Poverty and crime are connected. In fact, as our trusty producer, Cale Brooks, mentioned, poverty means you lack the means to meet your needs, and people turn to alternative means to get those resources. That increase in the immiseration of working people is tied to the decline of the labor movement and the ripping apart of the welfare state. When that happens, all that's left to deal with is social problem. All that's left to deal with social problems is police. So I think that that's actually a really good point. And to help reinforce that point, it's worth listening to Dr. Cedric Johnson, who touched on this during a 2019 talk. He specifically looked at how the neoliberal project scaled back crucial resources that helped to close the inequality gap.
After the major civil rights legislation in the 1960s, on the matter of health disparities, there's serious gains made by black people from that period going on, right? That the gaps begin to close on a number of different indicators in terms of health disparities. So life expectancy, child morbidity, all those things begin to close, right? You begin to see black people catching up in a way. When does it stop, though? It stops in 1980s onwards with neoliberalization. When all of those programs that had been crafted, through the Great Society, intended to try to help working class and poor blacks, when those things are pulled out. And then you see expansion of inequality, expansion of disparities from that point onwards. So again, these things are not fated, right? This is a choice that we're making as a society. It's the choice of certain groups of people to live with that kind of inequality.
I mean, when you really think about it, the neoliberal project and how it led to the inequality that we're experiencing today not only has an economic impact on people, it has an impact on what people have to resort to in order to survive. So when opportunities, especially economic opportunities, are scaled back, people disproportionately end up relying on criminal means to make a living. In fact, Dr. Cedric Johnson refers to that or talks about that in more detail in this next clip.
And that's essentially what you get in the 1970s and 80s in a lot of cities. Thousands of young black men and some older ones having to depend on, piecemeal work, informal economy, criminalized forms of work in order to survive. Now, not only during the 1980s do we get the rollback of the welfare state, or at least the beginnings of it. The Democrats would do their part in the 90s to demolish public housing, privatize various forms of support. But we also get this process of revanchism that I mentioned, right? This take back of the city, which is still ongoing, right? So we experience it now. If you have the money in your pocket, it's the good coffee, it's being able to have access to all sorts of different coffee and alcohol and cocktails and, the bon vivant urban life. But that's made possible through aggressive policing.
That talk is on YouTube. The top comment on it says, "I'm here because Michael Brooks sent me." Please watch it because it's an excellent talk, and I certainly got a lot out of watching it. Now, he talks about he talks about policing, and he talks about the brutality of it, and we honestly have quite a few examples of what that policing looks like. Unfortunately, it is now coupling up with Silicon Valley-based technology, things like artificial intelligence, to go even further in essentially speculating over who is likely to commit crime in the future. It's something known as predictive policing, and it's something that we absolutely need to push back on because it does not address the root of the problem. It doesn't address what causes crime. All it does is essentially provide more of a police state to indiscriminately spy on us, roll back our civil liberties, and essentially do whatever it takes to protect the system of neoliberalism that has led to the inequality that we're experiencing right now. The policing that we're experiencing in America is all about protecting capital. It's not about protecting and serving. Now, let's talk a little more about predictive policing, what it looks like, and how we need to push back against it. So here's a look at what a predictive policing program in Los Angeles looks like.
Say you're living in Los Angeles and you just got out of prison. The LAPD could be keeping tabs on you through a program known as Operation Laser. It uses crime, arrest, and field data to determine where violent crimes are likely to take place and who will perpetrate them.
Laser predicts who will commit a crime before a crime actually happens.
The Laser program tries to predict who might commit violent crime using a point system. For example, if you're on probation, that's 5 points on your record. If you're in a gang, that's another 5. A stop by police can get you another point. The people with the highest scores in each of LA's 21 divisions are placed on a list called the Chronic Offender Bulletin.
You tally up all those numbers. Some folks end up with 2 points, some folks end up with 40 points. Those that end up with the highest number of points, we'll take a look and see where are they now.
The most troubling thing about the Chronic Offender Bulletin, it's recriminalizing people who have already been on parole, who have served their time.
I mean, think about how crazy that is. And by the way, there's no transparency. So you have a local police department tallying up the number of times you've been stopped by cops on the road for something even as simple as a traffic ticket, right? Or a traffic violation. And then they use that data, that very data, to predict your future criminality. And what's terrifying about it is it leads to quite a bit of harassment, because if you've already been marked as a future criminal, cops are going to be keeping a close eye on you. And it does lead to this, environment of harassment. If that particular predictive policing program wasn't sketchy and scary enough, I think it's worth looking at what's going down in Pasco County, Florida, because Florida, they got to be extra and they always take it one step further. So Bobby Jones had been identified as a target by the Pasco Sheriff's Office's intelligence-led policing program. Police had gathered records of Bobby's previous interactions with law enforcement and were using his history to predict he would be a troublemaker in Pasco County. So Bobby Jones is not an adult. Bobby Jones, at the time that this was taking place, was a 16-year-old who had gotten in trouble with his previous school due to marijuana possession, and he also got into a physical fight with another student. His family wanted a fresh start, so they moved from their hometown to Pasco County, Florida, hoping that they could, just start over again and have good lives. But unfortunately, that was completely destroyed by the police department there that had already determined, without even meeting Bobby Jones, that he was a troublemaker who needed to be harassed. And they did harass him incessantly. Bobby had to deal with them literally just showing up to his house. At one point, they decided to help themselves to entering their home, the family's home, and they found baggies that did not have marijuana, but had marijuana residue. And the 16-year-old ended up spending 3 weeks in juvenile hall as a result of that. Now, a months-long ordeal followed, which Bobby's father, Robert Jones, described as a horror story of police showing up at the family home, sometimes multiple times a day or in the middle of the night, to inquire about Bobby or ask to enter the home. Anytime there was a crime in the neighborhood, such as burglary, Bobby was a suspect. As many as 18 officers would show up at the home, banging on windows and yelling at his young daughters while they were hiding under the bed. So the situation just kept going on and on and on. And little did Robert, the father, know that the local schools were actually sending data about students to the police department so they could basically beef up their data and use this system of predictive policing to hone in on certain individuals, in this case, students. From October of 2015 through April of 2016, Bobby, who had no previous criminal history, was arrested 5 times. None of those arrests resulted in a conviction. His home was ransacked, laptops and phones seized, and he ultimately fled their home in the middle of the night to avoid further harassment by police. Through this whole ordeal, it became abundantly clear that school districts were in fact sharing data about their students with local police departments. That data was then used to beef up the predictive policing, right? So the partnership gave the police access to data relating to students' grades, attendance, and behavior, as well as any history of abuse or other adverse childhood experiences. School records were used to allocate students one of 4 labels: on track, at risk, off track, or critical. Getting a D grade or having a parent or sibling go to prison could be enough to put a child in the at-risk category, according to Pasco's own 83-page intelligence-led policing manual. I mean, it's just absolutely terrifying. And the family fought back. Luckily, they fought back, and there were some efforts to scale back what this particular local police department was doing. So the Department of Education actually got involved and realized that this data sharing between the schools and the police department was against federal regulations. Under FERPA, as the regulation is known, a school is not allowed to disclose personally identifiable information from a student's education records without consent, although there are some exceptions for emergency situations. It's kind of unclear what those emergency situations are. It seems a little subjective, but nonetheless, at least there was some effort by the federal government to push back against what was happening in this Florida community. Now, another disastrous part about all of this is how predictive policing, which again relies on algorithms and artificial intelligence and data regarding students' grades and records and all that, it provides a veil of objective and non-discriminatory policing.
The fundamental question here is, can we trust the data and algorithms that police are using to predict crimes?
Algorithms and big data models simply take inputs, crunch them up to create outputs. So if your inputs are biased, your outputs are going to be biased.
You don't need to look far to find troubling examples of algorithmic bias. In 2016, Microsoft introduced an AI chatbot called Tay, which quickly started repeating racist and anti-Semitic comments it picked up on Twitter. Then there were those problematic Google autocompletes, which are based on popular human searches. In January, a Google search for Islamists are turned up results like Islamists are evil, and Hitler is turned up Hitler is my hero. And there was also the time the Google Images algorithm mistook black people for gorillas. So what happens if prejudice data makes its way into police work?
This is 7.
For Bari Williams, that risk is personal.
The biggest fear I have with predictive policing in my son is that he will be profiled. I'm sure he probably will experience that at some point in his life already, but I don't need something making that easier.
So, in other words, if predictive policing relies on data from flawed policing, from practices that have been discriminatory, whether it be racially motivated or overly punitive, all this technology would do is perpetuate more of the failed system that we're trying to change. So don't let anyone make you think or persuade you that technology-based policing using artificial intelligence is somehow non-biased. Remember, the very people creating the technology in the first place might have their own biases that seep into the technology. So it's important to keep that in mind. But the bigger picture that I want to focus on now is how we thought of policing prior to the pandemic, prior to the spike in violent crime. There were aggressive efforts to push back on militant policing, and there were some gains in that regard. But what we need to be careful about is the fact that if the left doesn't provide an alternative to that type of policing, the GOP and maybe even Democratic lawmakers will continue fear-mongering about the rise in crime rates, thus persuading people to maybe give up some of their civil liberties and privacy rights in order to support this kind of policing to feel safe. We can't let that happen. We need to provide better alternatives. And the good news is there are case studies. There's history to look at to see how there have been wonderful programs that have actually worked, economic opportunities that have actually pulled people away from a life of violence and crime. So let's talk about possible solutions. While researching about these possible solutions, I came across a perspective that should be explored more. So what if local governments actually spent nothing on indiscriminately surveilling innocent people and instead spent that cash on strengthening communities?
The real issue for us is, what is the correct response?
Harris Calvin points to a number of community-based violence prevention programs, like Violence Interrupters, which send community members to immediately meet with shooting victims to try to avoid retaliation. But the pandemic and the need for social distancing put many of these programs on hold.
There's actually a lot of truth to that. In fact, the Daily Beast touched on it just a little bit. I wish they explored it a little more. But Rachel Cohen writes, the pandemic weakened community institutions that experts say typically help deter crime. Patrick Sharkey, a sociologist and criminologist at Princeton, has said the corresponding disconnection from places like schools and pools and rec centers all help increase the conditions that may lead to violent behavior. Roman at the University of Chicago, too, has argued that the disruption of routine activities for large numbers of young men in poor areas likely contributed to violence with other young men in similar situations. Now, those community-based programs are important, and having this sense of community, having something positive and productive that people can focus on certainly does have an impact on crime. It certainly does lower crime. But I want to think bigger than that, because really what we should be thinking about is what this country has experienced in dipping crime rates as a result of economic opportunities being provided for people. Economic opportunities and state spending on community programs is a clear solution to tackling crime. If we don't address the root of crime, all we can expect is more aggressive policing to continue brutalizing the poor. And history does tend to repeat itself. I want to read a few excerpts from a Jacobin piece that is very relevant to this discussion. John Clegg and Andaner Usmani argue in Catalyst that the choice to respond to the 1960s crime wave with more incarceration lay not in white racial animus, but in the failure to build an egalitarian welfare state in America, the direct result of the underdevelopment of this country's labor movement. Without a strong working class movement to force the state to redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor, social democracy was a dead letter in America. This meant the American state was left with only one other, far less expensive option to address the violence brewing among the poorest and most vulnerable: prisons. So again, it goes back to actually addressing the root of crime. What leads people to engage in criminal activity? Is it because they're inherently bad, or is it because they felt they had no other choice to survive? And so when we think about something like a federal jobs guarantee, whether it be through Biden's infrastructure bill or through something like the Green New Deal, understand the importance of that, not just in uplifting Americans economically, but also simultaneously tackling a very serious problem that we're having right now regarding crime. Nando.
Some of these people, I feel like, need to watch a movie every once in a while and actually take the correct lessons from that movie. Like, did any of these people not watch Minority Report? You know, it's a great movie. Tom Cruise is in it. It's Steven Spielberg directed it. It's a great movie. Watch it. You know, that's a warning to this kind of technology, that is predictive crime. You know, that you just, no matter how hard you try, you're never going to be able to predict accurately, like, when an individual person is going to commit a crime. Come on. Or RoboCop or something. Just watch a movie, please. My God, like, this is crazy. But
I think they did watch the movie, but see it as like an instruction manual. You know what I'm saying?
Like, oh, it's so cool. We should do that. Instead of like, realizing that this is a goddamn nightmare. But yeah, I mean, I think that the broader point is well taken, and it's that there has been an increase in crime in the last year or two. I think that finding a neat narrative about it is going to be difficult, and it's going to take time and research and things like that. But the fact is, it is happening. Like a lot of people on the right like to say that it's due to defund the police, but it seems like the crime wave is happening in places where they've defunded the police a little bit, and in places where they haven't defunded the police. Like, it doesn't seem like it's a relevant factor, really. But it is happening, and you're right to seize on the idea that if we don't propose anything to that we're going to get like a right-wing backlash. Crime is a thing that just fuels right-wing politics always. And I think it's not, I think it's not a like, I think it's kind of instructive that the leader in the New York mayoral race is a guy named Eric Adams, who was a cop, who was a police chief. I mean, there has been a crime wave in New York. I mean, and he is supported not just by like right-wing maniacs. There's tons of black and brown people who are supporting him as well. So yeah, and we've talked about this in the past as well, that the increase in crime, but also just like the increase in homelessness is just ripe. All of that is just ripe for a right-wing backlash. And if we don't provide alternative policy solutions and take it seriously, then we're gonna end up losing in that, because some of the tendencies on the liberal left is to deny that it exists, or to put your head in the sand, and just like, if you just don't talk about it, it'll go away, and it won't.